40 years of environmental justice. 40 years of environmental justice. And now this. More frequent cases of extreme heat and heat waves sweeping across the West to the Midwest. More frequent cases of extreme cold and deep freeze rippling across the South and Southwest regions, regions which were not meant to be cold. And the worst part in all of this is we cannot simply legislate our way out of it. So it is kind of hard to imagine that a modern environmental justice movement that began 40 years ago back in Warren County, North Carolina, has now transformed into something that looks like this. No longer are the concerns of hazardous waste, air pollution, water quality, isolated concerns of historically marginalized communities, because my friends, heat waves and deep freeze have no boundaries. Good morning, everyone. I'm Shantonio Birch, recent PhD graduate from the University of Michigan and founder of Thermoverse. It gives me great joy to be giving this talk to you, despite the grim prospect and outlook on climate, because, like the Blue Mountain bird, I come bearing good news. But before going further, allow me to give you a brief background on myself. This is me chilling on the banks of Lake Lanier, AKA Old Oscarville, Georgia, back in 2014. This is what keeps me up at nights. And this is where I'm from. When I started college back in 2010, I came in with an innate passion to reduce the impact of carbon emissions on coral reefs. Exactly where this passion came from is quite elusive. After all, my mom's a nursing assistant, my dad's a musician. My grandfather, by my father's side, is a fisherman. And on my mother's side, we have a preacher. Point in case, I was both mesmerized and intrigued by these resilient ecosystems that I decided to walk away from pursue a prospective medical degree and instead pursue an engineering degree where I felt I could make the most impact. Now, fast forward 4 years, back to the back end of my undergraduate degree, from the time I started applying for my PhD application to the University of Michigan to the time I started my PhD program, there are a large swath of reefs across the American Samoa that become uninhabitable. And all it took was 2 to 4 degree change in Fahrenheit. Now, I can see very clear parallels between rising sea temperatures and what's going on in our very own backyards. It is not uncommon to see temperatures 5 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit above normal across the country. And within a 30-year span of time, we are yet to see more dangerous days of extreme heat, including in our very own Great Lakes state, which have been my home for the past 7 years. The truth is, so many of us are starting to live in these atmospheric bubbles that we call urban heat islands. And those living in the outer skirts of this dome are left to basically make up for the increased energy demand and coming from skyrocketing costs from space heating and cooling. The solution, of course, and perhaps reasonably so, is to electrify, and electrify quickly. Why? Because by electrifying, we decarbonize and get to net zero. And if we can get to net zero within a reasonable amount of time, we can keep the planet from warming 4 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels. Now, all this sounds nice and dandy, but who's going to pay the electricity bills when extreme cold and extreme heat becomes the norm? Is it the utility companies or energy commissioner's office? Is it the legislative body? that sets the price on utility and energy spendings? Or is it going to be you and I, the folks who braved the storm? We could look at the 2021 deep freeze back in Texas to get a sense of why electrification cannot move forward without further innovation. But we need not look beyond our own Great Lakes state. Do you guys remember the polar vortex back in 2019? Remember what came out of the governor's office and the energy commissioner's office? The message? Turn your thermostats down, 65 degrees Fahrenheit or below. Why? To avoid an increased surge in gas prices and a shutdown of the energy grid, one that I must remind you is not all electric as yet. Alas, alas, it may seem, after all, that our ambition for rapid industrialization has caught up to us. Perhaps electrification could reduce global temperatures, but it's not going to stop the increasing hundreds and thousands of heat-related incidents and hospitalizations reported by the CDC. But I'm not here to preach at you. After all, I'm not my mother's father. I come to bear good news. There are plenty of challenges taking place in Michigan through the American-Made Initiative, and plenty of teams who are competing, waiting for you to participate. This includes us, Thermoverse, who are taking bold and transformative action to electrify residential heating and cooling. Speaking of bold and transformative action, we also have our very own Mrs. Stoltz from A20. She was one of the speakers last year. And she's paving ways for building America's first fully decarbonized neighborhood in Bryant. Finally, we have our very good friends over at Fresh Coast who have mapped out a plan to take electrification one city at a time, starting with the city of Flint. Friends, neighbors, and colleagues, the future of innovation in climate resilience, environmental justice, and energy equity is bright. But we can only shine brighter when innovators and average Joes like you and I get together to ensure a clean, sustainable, and equitable transition to net zero. Thank you.